Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections since we are recording this session for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to get them answered online. We are particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Francis Rose, the host of In Depth with Francis Rose on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. Let me turn over the reins to Francis to begin today's discussion.
Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. Demographics is just one of the challenges that the federal government will face in the coming half-decade to 10 years when it comes to building an information technology workforce. That's the topic that we're going to address today with an expert panel on how to build an IT workforce that is relevant and useful and adds value to the federal government and ultimately to citizens in the coming decade. My guests on the panel today, Mike Casey, the Chief Learning Officer at the General Services Administration. Richard McKinney is the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Transportation and co-chair of the Workforce Panel on the Chief Information Officers Council. Brian Green of Learning Tree International and Richard Spires of Learning Tree International, the former CIO at the Department of Homeland Security and also at the Internal Revenue Service. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. Mike, I want to start with you. We talk a lot about the talent pipeline, and we talk about recruiting and retention. That's not enough, it strikes me, in 2015 with the generation of people that we want to recruit to come into the federal government. In the recruiting process, what's the role of you and your colleagues in the Chief Learning Officer community to give people a sense that the federal government is a place that they not just want to work at today, but will want to work at in the future through developing themselves in their careers?
Sure. You know, in the past, it was our responsibility to deliver training. What we're trying to do now is to shift that paradigm for our employees so that they understand the training and development opportunities are available to them, but part of the burden is on them to make sure that they're training or retraining themselves. As fast as the technology is training, there's no way we could deliver training on demand if we had to wait to see what it is. And so the idea is to empower our employees so that they know what the next project is going to require, what that next software or that next hardware is going to be, and then that training is out there so that they can reach out and get to it. With regard to recruiting, of course, then the trick is to make sure that we share that message up front. And we're doing it in our recruiting visits, but we're also doing it with our new employee orientation. We're doing it with our onboarding and all those other things, reinforcing the kinds of developmental opportunities that are out there for everyone, but also their responsibility to be helping us help them.
Richard, I've read various strategic plans that your colleagues in the Chief Information Officer community have for aligning mission and workforce. What do you think is the state of the art of that concept right now, and what are you hearing from your peers on the CIO Council about how they are trying to make sure that they're peopled up the right way for the coming 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think all of us are trying to, when we all acknowledge the pace of change, you know, how we're shifting from a data center based technology to a cloud based technology, and all how the data center and the provisioning of basic IT infrastructure, how that's changing, around application development, how that world is changing. And I think all of us are, trying to figure out ways that we can keep our work, bring our workforce to these new technologies, to these new job assignments that we're giving them, and properly equip them. And part of what we're doing is individual training. The other thing that is part of the IT workforce is we're trying to, we've sponsored symposiums where we bring people together and we let people share best practices and learn from each other. I was on we had a IT Solutions Challenge that I was one of the judges that concluded yesterday, and where we brought from every department, we brought I think it was 36 young employees together, put them into 6 teams and had them all work on a different IT solutions. And then we had judges and we judged and there were winners, and we had some great ideas come out of that. And some of it is we're getting work product out of that, but we're also trying to build community, because a lot of IT is from, passing from one person to another, and so we're trying to strengthen those opportunities. And so a lot going on trying to keep up with the pace of change that challenges us.
Richard Spires, I imagine that the workforce portfolio, the total realm of skills that are needed in the IT workforce today are dramatically different than when you went to the IRS, and dramatically different than when you went to DHS, and probably are somewhat different or maybe significantly different than even what you needed when you left DHS just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, Francis, as Richard said, the pace of change is so significant. New technologies, new methodologies being introduced all the time. And it is, I mean, that is a major challenge for a CIO and his or her management team. How do you keep your workforce fully skilled to be able to take advantage of those new technologies and processes? And I think, as a matter of fact, that's where I think many organizations, not just in government, by the way, really fall down, because they're stuck with this legacy environment, and that's what they know, and it makes it very, very difficult for sometimes people to break away and get those new skills, to bring in new technologies and new methodologies. And you see that so much in many IT organizations.
I want to pick up on that idea of being stuck with a legacy environment, because I think that's right on point. Brian, what we hear so far is a rapid pace of change, both from Mike and from both Richards, and we also hear all over the place, not just in this discussion, about a changing landscape of people that are coming into the pipeline. What does that mean for the way that agencies should be thinking about how they want to deliver training, information, learning to their workforces?
Good question. I think if you look at the landscape of training and how it's evolved, certainly in the last 5 years, but certainly over the last 15 to 20 years, we've moved from an environment where we were highly dedicated and highly driven towards the instructor-led training, right? Having an expert up there amongst a host of peers, employees, if you will, in whatever discipline that might be, management disciplines, IT. But the modalities, if you will, that are now available, right? The internet certainly provided a lot of information that's out there now for free, right? And so there is a model that's out there called the 5 moments of learning needs that is really beginning to change the way in which that we learn. And with all of the blogs and the free information that's out there, learning is become in bite-sized chunks, if you will, very relevant way, right? A very relevant way of learning. There's also the consistency that a subject matter expert that they provide in instilling disciplines, instilling best practices and whatnot. So this concept of a blended approach absolutely is relevant today. We have millennials who like learning in very specific bite-sized chunks. We have the established workforce that still likes going away for 3 or 4 days, collaborating with their peers. So I don't think there's any one particular answer. I think it is, however, a blended approach that is really the flavor of the day.
Mm-hmm. The reason, Richard Spires, I thought your comment about legacy environment was so useful is because, Mike, this is what you dealt with when you walked into the CLO job at the General Services Administration, and you and I have spoken on a number of occasions about what you've tried to do, not to get rid of it, because there's still value in the model that Brian was talking about, instructor in the front, 20 to 30 people in the seats, but that's not the only solution anymore, right?
No, it absolutely can't be. Jim Kirkpatrick has a wonderful quote, and I might not get it exactly right, but he talks about the myth that the act of teaching is enough to get the job done. Mm-hmm. Yes, we need to train. We need to make sure that the subject matter expert is putting out that information, but it isn't enough to just be keeping track of who was sitting in the room when those words were spoken. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, it's a challenge as the technology is changing so fast, but this is also a wonderful opportunity for us to be transitioning from training to learning to performance. And clearly Brian is seeing this the same way I do. That's the direction we're going. And this technology that's changing fast is also helping us to do that, mm-hmm. To shift our focus from the training to the learning to the development.
Mm-hmm. Are there missing links in the onboarding process, Richard? You've selected the people you want to bring in. You're comfortable and confident they have the skills that you want to at least develop in them, and then they come in. Are you seeing a lot of synchronization between not just at your agency, but across government, between your agency or your office and the Human Capital Office and the Learning Office to make sure that, especially in that critical first 6 months to year period, people are getting the skills that they need to really grow into what you want them to become?
Yeah, it is an issue, and it's something that I'm confronting at the Department of Transportation. I don't believe, that we do as good a job of that as we ought to do. And, I'm actually really glad to be on this panel with Mike, because I'm in the process of hiring a chief learning officer. So I'm going to pick your brain a little. Later we'll have a conversation. But what I'm recognizing is that exactly not, we bring folks in and we put them in roles, and we don't necessarily quite give them the opportunity to train up before we stick them in those roles. And I also think that we put computers in front of folks, and we don't necessarily do a great job of training them, which then makes it harder for my office to support them, because the user base doesn't have the skill sets that they ought to have. So I want to improve not only in my shop but across the department as a whole.
And when you frame it like that, it makes me think too that the emphasis is not just on training how to use various applications that somebody will want to use. That's kind of a low level, with no disrespect intended to the people that use Microsoft Word or whatever. But then there's also a lot of steps in between. And eventually you also have the high level IT workforce training issues like leadership skills and who becomes the next Richard McKinney at some point.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion around the CIO Council, primarily led by Tony Scott. Tony came in, and one of the things I think he's challenging all of us is, where are you at with succession planning? How are you preparing the younger employees to assume these roles when you are gone? And there's a number of initiatives that we're starting where we're going to be identifying some employees, and we're going to be giving them some training along those lines as part of, again, that emphasis on succession planning. So, a lot of emphasis around the council right now on workforce development, which, as co-chair of that committee, we welcome this attention and this emphasis.
And again, Brian, I don't mean to denigrate the idea of training somebody that they should or shouldn't do certain things technologically, or how they should use passwords and all that kind of stuff. But the next layers up strike me as what will be the most critical, especially if we have a retirement wave that people keep talking about. How we develop the successors, as Richard is talking about, strikes me as the training element that's really important. What are the good strategies that you've seen agencies deploy to be able to do that, and where are some of the places that you've seen some efforts fall short?
Yeah, great question. If you look at the earlier comment about this, the availability of learning on the internet, a lot of that stuff is now available. So the tactical training, if you will, very inexpensive, very accessible. I think to Richard's point about looking at job roles, we're seeing the predominant approach becoming very performance-based, role-based, skill-based. And so if you look at an individual who comes into an organization, both in the public or the private sector, and you look at how that individual is going to be measured, right? How their performance is going to be measured. A lot of it really starts at the job role. What job is it that they're filling? What's their expectations? What's the level of authority that they have, right? A lot of people go to training, receive best practices, go back to work, and they don't have the authority to actually execute. So how that job role is clearly defined, both to the individual as well as the organization, is critical. The other element that we talk a lot about and that we're seeing a lot about is also that ability to apply those best practices once they're back into that ecosystem, if you will, right? Once they're back into the job, is the environment ripe for them to be able to succeed? Work with their peers, their subordinates, their leadership to really be able to execute? Best practices in an ad hoc environment cannot be applied. So it really is this total concept of how do we ensure that we have the right individuals with the right skills in the right organization, but also on the right projects.
Mike, I want to come back to you on the collaboration piece. Richard talked a little bit about the necessity of collaboration between an office like yours and an office like his. How do you see that from the training and education and learning perspective?
Well, it takes two, absolutely. We have to work together on that, and that's why you have an OHRM or someone doing the human capital planning. I saw a quote the other day about how supervisors are the most untrained segment of our population. I don't know that that's completely true, and certainly there are pockets of success out there, but every IT, every cyber worker has a supervisor. And so one of the ways that you can help that whole workforce is to improve those supervisors. And of course, they're probably IT folks as well.
Yep.
And so, in the Navy, we used to talk about how chief petty officers were the backbone of the fleet. Well, first-line supervisors are the backbone of the federal government. So we work on our supervisory training to provide that kind of direct support down there. And then we develop succession planning so that we can figure out who that next generation is. And the more targeted that can be, not everyone is destined to be a future CIO. We need to know that and not try and develop training and development that tries to turn everyone into a future CIO.
Richard Spires, final thought. We just have a minute or so left in this segment, but what Mike said reminds me of a conversation you and I have had before about doing that inside the Department of Homeland Security in light of some of the numbers that we've seen in the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey,
yes,
where a lot of people's sticking point is that first-line supervisor.
Well, yeah, I would pick up on that point, but also this notion that I think what we don't do a good enough job of is really working with people. They come into the government or in any organization and really talking to them and thinking about, where do you want to be in 5 years, right? What's your professional aspirations, right? I mean, do you want to be a CIO someday, right? Now, we might have to have the hard discussion that says, well, that's really nice, but you're probably not going to be able to do that given your skill set. But you come up with realistic plans and really help people achieve those objectives over a 5 to 10 year period. And I tell you what, you want retention, that's how you build retention, right? I mean, when people feel valued and that they want to learn and you want them to learn and you're coordinated in that, I think that's where first-line supervisors could really improve.
Richard Spires of Learning Tree International, one of the guests on our panel discussion today. IT workforce optimization, the new alignment between mission needs and human capital, and we'll be right back.